Hello, everyone that's here with us today. My name is Cecilia, and I am the media coordinator here at IATP. You might have seen me on a couple of our last Facebook Lives over the past weeks, but today I am joined by our Shefali Sharma, who is the director of IATP Europe. On Monday, we launched an exciting new report titled Milking the Planet: How Big Dairy is Heating Up the Planet and Hollowing Rural Communities. And in the report, we found that in just 2 years, the total combined greenhouse gas emissions of 13 of the world's largest dairy corporations rose by 11%. And in the same time, farmers slid further into debt and farm foreclosure. So Shefali, the author of the report, today will tell us a little bit more about her key findings in the report and what some of our proposed solutions are. So Shefali, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce yourself to our viewing audience.
Hey everyone, I'm Shefali Sharma. I'm based here in Berlin in Germany, where it's evening, and I'm the director of the European office here for IATP.
Wonderful. So as I mentioned, we launched our new report, Milking the Planet, on Monday of this week. And it's a continuation of our Emissions Impossible series, the first report which we launched in 2018. That report revealed how big meat and dairy are heating up the planet. So can you give us a little background, Shefali, on why IATP first decided to tackle the issue of industrialized agriculture's greenhouse gas emissions?
Sure. The 2018 report we launched with another nonprofit NGO named Grain. And it was actually Grain that had come up with this genius idea of looking at accounting for emissions from the big meat processors and dairy processors, these transnational corporations that move milk and meat across the planet and are pretty key players in the food system. And also in terms of feed and feed grains, companies like Cargill, they double up as both grain traders and meat processors. And not very many people know about these companies because most of the meat, milk products are behind other brands. So you don't see the names of these companies as prominently. And IATP started started looking at the livestock industry back in 2013. We published a series of reports because we feel like it's a fundamental part of what is wrong with the industrial agriculture and that model of production. And these guys are key players. We felt like focusing attention on their climate footprint was a way to refocus again about all the problems that we see with market concentration and why it's highly problematic that these companies keep getting bigger and prices paid to producers keeps going lower. And so this was a great way for us to kind of shine a new light as to why the same problems that we've been trying to address for years can be tackled both in terms of the climate, the environment, and also rural resilience. What is the way forward there?
Wonderful. So in this new report, we focus on the dairy industry specifically, and that report is linked in the comment section here, so people can click on that either now or later on and read through the entire report. And I also do want to remind people that as we continue to discuss this report in particular, please feel free to leave questions or comments in the comment section here on Facebook. And at the end, we can have a little bit of a Q&A session and address your questions. So Shefali, could you give us maybe some key findings or key messages from this new Milking the Planet report?
Well, what we found is that companies in many instances really increase their emissions. You see that companies like Lactalis or Saputo increase their emissions by 30% for Lactalis, 27% for Saputo, and that was in large part because they did merge and acquire lots of other companies. So there's this question like, well, these are old emissions, not new emissions. They're just the growth is due to, acquiring other companies. But I think for us, the main point there is that when companies decide to become bigger, they make an economic and a growth strategy, and that means that they have to take responsibility for the emissions that occur in that system, and therefore they should take responsibility for the emissions of their subsidiaries or whoever they acquire. So, and also just to point out that milk production also, that intake of milk increased by 8%. So it's an important figure that needs to be highlighted. But for us on this report, I think a critical finding for us was that even as these companies got bigger and their emissions rose, we saw the continued disempowerment of rural communities and rural dairy producers, because the prices paid to them continue to get lower and lower as this model perpetuates overproduction. And so we have a few companies, they set the price is extremely low. It doesn't even meet the cost of production, let alone a reasonable profit. And this is a race to the bottom. Farmers have to either get big or get out. And this is a problem for rural communities. And what we're saying is that another way is possible. There needs to be a comprehensive set of farm, trade, and climate policies that address the risks and the financial burdens that farmers have to take on, as we should rightfully be strengthening in each country and region our climate ambition, our environmental regulations, the public health impacts of overuse of antibiotics, fair wages. These are all things that we need to, and especially with COVID now, it's clear, right? We need to have living wages and predictable salaries. And that goes for rural communities as well. Why should corporations continue to profit and make record profits while rural communities that are actually supplying these things continue to suffer? So
okay, so now let's kind of get down into some more details of the report. So thank you for that high-level summary of our findings. So you mentioned in your response that, even if some of these emissions are old emissions, corporations, as they merge and acquire new corporations, should still be held accountable to their emissions. Do any companies have goals set to cut emissions from their dairy supply chain?
Yes, we took a very in-depth look at these 13 companies. We have a detailed annex in the back, 2 annexes, one that looks at their emissions. For the very few that were actually reporting their emissions, I believe there were 5 out of 13 that were actually reporting their emissions. What we found is, yes, there are some climate targets. There's no consistency in terms of these companies' baselines, like how are they measuring their climate reductions, like starting from which year to which year. And most of them don't actually commit to absolute reductions of their emissions from their supply chain, which means they don't commit to an overall reduction of their dairy emissions from their dairy supply chains.
Okay.
Now, and that's where 90% of the greenhouse gas emissions stem from in the dairy sector, right? So one could say, hey, so what you're actually saying is you should make these farmers do the right thing. And so you're actually putting the onus of the emissions reductions on the producers. But what we're actually saying is, no, the corporations should be held accountable to pay the cost of production that includes this shift towards a much more sustainable way of dairying, including a reduction in stocking densities on pasture and moving away from this industrial feedlot version of, hundreds of cows, depending on feedlots, and huge manure lagoons that pollute not just the climate, but also the air and we breathe and the water we drink, and the nuisance that it causes to rural communities. So there's a whole lot of dimensions to this beyond just the climate.
Are any of these companies, is there a requirement to report emissions right now?
There is absolutely no requirement for even transparency about what they produce. How much are they producing? Yes, this is a big gap that we found, which is that there's no obligations to report your emissions. There's no obligations to set consistent targets across the sector. You know, every company, the few that have targets are, you know, have different baselines, as I said. But even more, right? We don't know how much, you know, we've gotten this data on milk intake from IFCN, which is a dairy industry publication and operation. But these companies could easily publish how much milk intake they have and from which regions. And why shouldn't they? Because they also benefit from public taxpayer money that, you know, goes to their supply chain. So in some ways they're, you know, involved in that. They're a critical part of that. And these things should be required, I think, not just from the dairy sector, but from all sectors at this point.
Yeah, yeah. So speaking of reduction targets, in the report, you mentioned that some companies have emissions intensity reduction targets like Danone. Can you explain a little bit about what is an emissions intensity reduction?
Sure. It's a very important question because this is the key thrust of where agribusiness is going in terms of saying, hey, we're doing something about the climate. It's about reducing emissions per unit of food produced. So it's about, you know, how many gallons of milk is the dairy farmers of America responsible for. And incidentally, Dairy Farmers of America is one of those companies that publishes nothing about their emissions and doesn't have climate reduction targets, but that we know of, at least not publicly. But yeah, so it's like, you know, if you are reducing emissions per unit of milk, per gallon of milk, which means maybe you're cleaning up your operations or your transport or something as a company, but you're doing nothing about your supply chain. So each year you have, you know, 1,000 more animals per farm, right? Like if you keep increasing the number of animals, your overall emissions are going to go up. And so even if you're reducing per unit, at the end of the day, what matters for the climate is whether you're reducing your overall emissions and not just the emissions intensity. That's not to say that we don't think emissions intensity reductions are important, but I think it takes you into a trap, right? Because what it does is it promotes an industrial system. It says, hey, economies of scale, it's efficient. So it's okay if we keep increasing and, you know, keep overproducing, as long as each gallon that we're producing emits less. And that's just not going to work for the climate. So this is a central point. And I think the second point is that, as we've said, for the livestock sector, we need a holistic solution. It's not just the fact that you're going to have these incremental gains in each gallon that you produce. Each gallon that you produce, if it's based on a feedlot system and a high stocking density overgrazed system, is going to create land degradation. It's going to create air and water pollution. It's going to make the soils less resilient to climate. And that's our fundamental thing. We want to move in this day and age towards much more resilient systems for rural communities and for the climate. And this system is not going to get us there.
Got it. Okay. I just want to remind everyone that if you have any questions about what Shefali is sharing, to please leave them in the comment section and we'll get to them. So Shefali, in the report, you we talk about 4 specific dairy producing regions of the world: the United States, the European Union, India, and New Zealand. Can you say a little bit about the problems that rural communities are facing in each of these regions?
Sure. I think like when you look at the US and you see the number of farms that have disappeared over a 30-year period, it's staggering to see that number. Farm debt has gone up dramatically. If we look at the milk prices, and this is the section in the US, and you see this in Wisconsin and elsewhere, there's overproduction and milk prices have dropped dramatically for producers. They can't make their ends meet, and so they have to leave. You know, recently, it was very sad to see Jim Goodman, who was with the National Family Farm Coalition, he lost his historical dairy herd in this whole process. I think that's heartbreaking. That shouldn't have to happen. And we're seeing the same thing happening in Europe. We have a chart in the paper that looks at between 2013 and 2017, Germany, Netherlands, France, and in each instance, the milk, the price paid to producers is so much lower than the market price, right? And how are you supposed to make a living? And this has happened at a time when the EU removed its milk quota. So that meant unlimited milk goes into the market. And what we're saying is, look, supply management, we had it. We had it in the United States. It was dismantled because of the Farm Bill. The EU had a system of supply management. It has been eroded and now gone. And Canada's supply management system, it exists, which is great. It's being eroded through free trade agreements. So we need to come back to supply management. We need to manage oversupply and balance prices and demand that way.
Got it. What about India? I know India is a bit of a unique case in how their dairy industry is structured.
Yeah, India is a very unique case. And, you know, let's be clear, Amul, which is the cooperative that's featured in here, is in no way in shape or form similar to Lactalis, right? Okay. It produces half of what the French transnational Lactalis produces. It has millions of very poor and marginal farmers that are part of that supply chain. But Amul made some bad policy decisions in these last few years in terms of, you know, exporting. And again, it's shaped by the world market, right? So we had low milk prices in the global market. Amul had made itself much more open and had started exporting a lot. And when the milk prices crashed, it had to reconstitute its milk powder back into fluid milk into the market. And it really destabilized milk producers in India because the milk prices came crashing down. So you see this, and the same thing in New Zealand, right? Fonterra is a huge player in New Zealand. New Zealand's dairy herds have gone up significantly. That rate is declining, I guess, in the last 10 years, but it doesn't change the fact that, you know, half of New Zealand's emissions come from the agriculture sector, and dairying is a big part of that. If you look at the global production, New Zealand, you know, doesn't produce so much milk compared to, say, the European Union, the United States, or India. But when you look at exports, and particularly whole milk powder exports, for instance, 75, you know, nearly 75% of all global exports come from New Zealand of whole milk powder. So, you know, Fonterra also made this decision to go out and export whole milk powder and skim milk powder. And what we've seen in the last decade is that their farmer cooperative shareholders have suffered in that process. Farm debt in New Zealand has increased from 2003 to 2019 by 30.1 billion New Zealand dollars. That's significant. So that means the system is broken, and we see that the system is broken across these regions, right? My fear is that India is moving towards that, and to that broken system that we have in the United States and in the US. And there are lessons that India can learn from this, that, you know, and India has a huge domestic market. So there's a lot that can be done in terms of good farm policy and climate policy and trade policy in India that could actually be pro-rural communities and marginalized people.
Okay. So speaking of the broken system, I know that during the COVID-19 pandemic here in the United States, as restaurants shut down and schools and other key purchasers of dairy products, farmers were kind of left in a lurch, and we saw images on the news of milk being poured down the drains as there was too much supply of milk. Did the pandemic create new issues in the dairy system, or did it just amplify those pre-existing systemic issues that were already there?
The new thing was that it was a sudden shock, right?
Okay.
It was like all of a sudden the shutdown happens, but the pre-existing problems were that there was overproduction, and And the risk was totally being borne by these producers, right? So all of a sudden they have nowhere to go. The corporations wash their hands off of it. So they've had to pour their milk down. I mean, and that's not to say that many dairy processors, that there were dairy processors who tried to help their cooperatives, and they tried to help producers and see if they could find markets. But the system is skewed, right? And it's weighed against the producers themselves. And I think that COVID should be a wake-up call for us to fix that and to prepare for crises, because the climate crisis is not unlike these sudden shocks and that COVID. And so we should be prepared for that. We should make more resilient systems so that farmers don't have to, from the one day to the next, all of a sudden find themselves like with a glut of milk and with nowhere to go.
Yeah.
And having to bear all the risks.
Of course. So would a supply management system here in the United States or elsewhere help prepare for a future crisis that would shock the system?
It would certainly help. I mean, that's not to say that in Canada they didn't spill milk even with a supply management system, but certainly the farmers were much better off in Canada because they had a supply management system than they do in the US. So yes, there's something we can learn from that. But it also means that we have to be very mindful of different policies and their roles, right? We also need a social safety net. People went hungry as well at the same time as milk was being spilled and other agricultural products went to waste. So what can we learn from that? And what are the social safety nets we need for people who do not have food? And what is the role of government there? The government has to step in because the markets are failing in that realm. And that's something we need to learn. And I think this is a big call in our report, right? We want governments to redirect funds away from this industrial system, this race to the bottom system. We want governments to regulate the worst impacts of the system, the environmental, social, public health problems of this. And we want governments to help regenerate rural communities and soils to create resilience, both climate resilience and livelihood resilience. And these are all fundamental for getting through the COVID crisis as well as the climate crisis.
So I want to go more into solutions that we're proposing in the way out. But before I do so, I'm going to switch gears a little bit. I know that good pasture management also sequesters carbon into the ground. Is there a reason why we didn't bring that into this report?
Yeah, and the reason we didn't bring it into the report is because our focus was on why the industrial economies of scale, intensification system is bad for the climate and for rural communities. Yes, we see a huge potential for carbon sequestration from well-managed pasture. But we didn't want to play into the hands of the carbon market lobby and carbon trading, right? Because there's a whole other can of worms when it comes to monitoring and reporting and accounting for carbon that's sequestered in soils. There's a whole market being made of that. And that's a highly problematic market in itself. We do believe that governments can support carbon sequestration through good practices that are going to last. But there are other ways to help increase carbon sequestration and other elements in agriculture, right? Creating more resilience, better biodiversity, better water, better air. And these are things that can be done through a comprehensive set of policies. And that's one of the reasons why we didn't tackle that, because we were targeting a certain model of production that we think is destructive.
Yes, so we are tackling that in other areas. Actually, just last week, Tara was on a Facebook Live here on our Facebook page addressing issues in carbon markets and why they don't work for agriculture. So if people are interested, I encourage you to watch the recording of last week's conversation.
Absolutely, and we're involved in conversations that have to do with how do we build soil health and what are the incentives that are needed to help build soil health in agricultural practices. So yes, we're doing that work as well. Definitely. I personally am not doing it, but IATP is.
Yes. Yes. So Shefali, you just kind of mentioned some of the ways out, what can be done to end this crisis. Is there anything else that you want to touch on there?
You know, there's been a lot of response since we've launched the report. There has been a statement from the International Dairy Federation. Companies are clamoring and saying, you know, IATP is just kind of highlighting all the negative aspects, and we feed the world. And simply want to address the fact that, you know, the facts are glaring in terms of what's happening to rural communities that depend on dairy. And the facts are glaring that agriculture as a whole will and has to do something about its emissions, and that biodiversity and other key environmental indicators that we have for a healthy planet are you know, severely in trouble. And so for it's not good enough to just say, you know, we should just keep continuing business as usual. And if you question it, then you're basically questioning why you that, you know, we feed the world, etc. And the fact is that many communities are you know, feeding people around them in their local communities, and the flooding of cheap imports, dairy imports, is destabilizing those markets, and that there is a growing movement to actually rebuild communities, both in the US and the EU and in India and New Zealand. And what we're saying is that vision, that world is possible, and it's in our power. And there's a lot that is out there in terms of the policies that we need to be able to fix that. But we need the political will from governments to do it.
Yeah. Are there any policy recommendations out there right now that do incorporate those solutions and that grander vision?
Yes, absolutely. There's no one policy that's going to do all of that, but some of them I've mentioned in this conversation. Supply management is one key thing, making sure that you know, producers are paid their cost of production and a reasonable profit, and that public subsidies go towards regenerating rather than this destructive model of production. Trade policies have to align with what our vision is of a 21st century planet, which means that trade policies shouldn't be you know, forcing governments to deregulate public interest regulations on the environment and social issues in terms of fair wages, etc. And that market access for these corporations is not the be all end all, right? We need to make sure that governments have the power and the vision to be able to create a food secure nation, and that there's an important role for trade to play in that. We believe in you know, multilateral trading rules, but they just need to look very differently if we want to have a healthy planet.
Definitely. Wonderful. Shefali, is there anything else you want to add before we wrap up our conversation? Any other points from the report that we didn't get to in this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's critical that we look at climate policy when it comes to agriculture in a holistic manner. We need to integrate some of these factors into what a climate policy needs to look like. It's clear that climate policy in industrialized countries needs to include agriculture. It needs to ensure that that we penalize a very destructive model of production, and we move towards a just transition, towards a transformative agroecological regenerative form of agriculture.
Wonderful.